It's a battle of freedom of speech that has been going on since COVID-19 lockdowns in British Columbia and shockingly hasn't come to an end. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, standing in front of the Chilliwack Law Courts to bring you an update on 3 Fraser Valley churches' battle with the provincial government to be able to worship without persecution. If you've been following us at Rebel News, especially through lockdowns, then you know that unelected health lords across the country, like British Columbia's public health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, used COVID-19 as an excuse to crush on Canadians' freedom of religion. Not just all Canadians, it ended up being the Christians. We showed you it was Christian pastors who were the ones who got thrown in jail. It was Christian pastors who were the ones who got fined. Not too shocking, since Christians are the most persecuted religion across the world. Today, I stand in front of this courthouse to give you an update on day 1 of a 13, or what's expected to be a 13-day proceeding about an abuse of process legal action that's being taken on behalf of 3 Fraser Valley churches that were fined, and in some case with one pastor, the pastor was even found guilty. That's Pastor Koopman. I'm going to go in there and get some details about what's going on, and then I have an interview up for you with the lawyer. His name is Paul Jaffe, who's representing the churches, and he's contracted by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. We're going to hear what his submissions are today on day 1, and you should know, if you haven't already been following this situation, this is in addition to a case that was fought and lost, where the government won the right to keep the churches closed in the thick of it. We covered that as well. I will link that in the description box below. The hearing is currently on a break, and I hate to make myself part of the story, but it's not really me, it's the court staff, as well as Judge Ormondson herself. Let me explain. Since I've been in there trying to cover the story for you, it's been hard to do so. I've been interrupted several times. The first, pretty standard, was a sheriff asking me to present my accreditation. I did so. That's usually the end of it, but it wasn't. Then later, that same sheriff says, you know what, the sheriff downstairs says you can't have your tripod up here. Okay, I've had my tripod up here in different cases before in this courthouse and others, but you know what, I'll go down to the bottom of the courthouse and check that in with that sheriff. So I go ahead and do so. I get asked, do you have a camera? Not that uncommon of a question, since I'm well aware as a journalist you can't film with a camera in there. So I say no, and I go back up and I go, great, now I can cover the story. I sit down and Judge Ormondson keeps looking at me. She's looking at me as I'm typing, and mind you, this is like just minutes of me finally getting adjusted to type what she's saying, and she just suddenly stops the proceeding. She says, you know what, I'm sorry, I have to go. I'm sorry for this. We're going to have to stand down. Mind you, this was after she had just cautioned counsel for the churches to be timely, or else she was going to cut him off at the end of the day if he wasn't. So now here she is, halting the case, halting the proceedings for, I don't know, maybe she had to use the washer, which would be okay. Except 10 minutes or so pass, and a sheriff beelines over to me and asks for my accreditation again. Doesn't ask the other journalist for the accreditation again, just me. So I give it, and he examines it for a very long time, as if maybe it's a counterfeit one. So he gives it back to me, and that's fine. So we wait some more time, and then a clerk comes out and she says, I'm sorry, it's going to be a little bit longer because the judge and the sheriff still have something to sort out. So now I'm like, okay, this is looking like it's about me. I saw that judge looking at me. She claims they had to be timely, and then she's stopping this for, it's got to be 20 minutes now. And by the way, she stopped this just before a break was about to happen. So eventually she comes out and she goes, okay, we can proceed, but I want to make it clear. I welcome the media, but under no circumstances is there to be any video recording. So it's me. Okay, so there you have it. She has some sort of beef. Let's be professional. Let's get on the case and let me do my job on behalf of the public. Nope, not at all. Instead, another sheriff comes, beelines behind me, this time with a white notepad, and sits directly behind me to spy on me. So I get up and I move. I move to the farthest way, to the left. It's just me and the other approved journalist, of course, the one the judge must like. And he starts looking me out of the side of his eyes. Again, I'm trying to cover a case for you guys. So eventually, at one point, he says, "Can you angle your phone differently?" He walks up to me and says that. Now, I put my phone, and I do this in every hearing, on this little stand you're seeing right now, so my neck doesn't fall off, because after a while it starts to hurt if you're looking down. So I say, no, I'm not angling my phone differently, and can I speak to you outside? So we go outside the room, and I say, listen, I'm a professional, I know the rules, and I don't need you spying on me, and I certainly don't need to angle my phone in a position that's going to make it more difficult for me to type. So he says he's got some information that I might have been taking pictures and video. And I said, from whom? He says, I can't tell you that. Oh, I wonder if it's Judge Ormiston, who halted the proceedings for at least 20 minutes when she said things need to be timely. I guess we'll never know. Well, I gave him a piece of my mind, and he let me go in and hold my phone the way I want to hold it to take notes for you. And thank you for listening to this rant. I'm going to go back in and try and be reporting for you without freedom of press being interrupted. And then I plan to interview counsel for the churches, Paul Jaffe, to give you an update on day one of this trial. What exactly is on the line for your clients? What's hinging on this case?
What's hinging on this case is whether the justice system is brought into disrepute when it implicitly endorses the kind of misconduct which we're able to show took place. And with respect to the one client that did have a trial, a conventional trial, he was found guilty primarily because the gathering at issue was a worship gathering rather than, quote, a support group, which was permissible under the Gathering and Events Order. And of course, he gave significant evidence on the fact that a worship gathering does provide those same functions that support groups do, the difference being that the Bible comes out and there may be some reference to the scriptures or something in a worship gathering, and it's that which distinguishes it from a support group, and it's that which he was convicted for. And our argument is, how could that be the case in Canada with these supposedly guaranteed constitutional rights?
Well, there's no doubt that church is a support group. In fact, one of the churches that we're getting fined in Kelowna, Harvest Ministries, I went down there and there were people traveling because it was the only thing open in such a lonely, dark time. And more than one of them said they felt like they would have actually ended their life if they didn't find refuge in the church. Now, are there convictions, potential convictions, that the other pastors could face here?
Well, what has happened is that when the judge convicted Pastor Koopman, having had a regular trial, it was all without prejudice to advancing this abuse of process claim, which we're now doing. And that same right exists for all of our clients with respect to all of these tickets. They've all been found guilty in a sense. There was a sort of a package deal agreed to where my clients called no evidence. They agreed to certain facts. Convictions were made, all subject to the outcome of this abusive process effort that we're now making. The present effort is not focusing on the enactment, but focusing on the conduct of Dr. Henry and whether or not it meets the ethical standards which the public would expect. And we say it clearly doesn't for a number of reasons, including the fact that unknown to all of the churches, some of whom we act for, Dr. Henry had recognized that worship gatherings outside were low risk and permissible with the synagogues, for instance. A class variance was granted to the synagogues right after the initial Gathering and Events Order, but that was unknown to any of the churches. They were never given the option to worship outdoors. Under the Gathering and Events Orders, all worship gatherings, inside or outside, regardless of how long and how many participants, whatever safety protocols were complied with, the masking, social distancing, contact tracing, all of these things, immaterial. Simply worshiping was made illegal. Full stop. And so we found out in the course of litigation that they had accommodated the synagogues, which was great because they should have, but they did nothing for the churches. So there's discriminatory treatment under these orders. So that's one reason we are challenging, we are raising the abusive process. Another one was that in the midst of litigation, within a couple of days of each other, the synagogues were granted permission to worship indoors on the basis that the COVID case numbers were coming down and the safety protocols were more than enough to make it a low-risk event. At the same time, as we were going into the court within a day or so on the Baudouin case, the big first challenge to these things, they issued us a notice that worshiping indoors was unsafe, relying on the same data but arriving at the opposite conclusion.
This was within 24 hours of each other, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And the synagogue communications were expected to be confidential. They didn't know that we would find out about it.
Well, it sounds like a clear bias to me. I'm not a judge, but I'm reminded of one of the biases that I saw actually with one of the churches you're representing, Riverside Calvary Chapel. While they were getting fined, right down the street from them, there was a church. It was packed, no social distancing. You were allowed, if you were Hollywood, to pretend to be worshiping God indoors for a movie, but down the street you couldn't do the real thing under Dr. Bonnie Henry. Now, much of, if not all, of what we saw today was submissions from you trying to qualify certain expert witnesses. Talk about who those are and why they're important to the case.
In the present case, we've offered to call Dr. Richard Shabbos, who is the former provincial health officer from Ontario. He's a very qualified person in the field of public health, and he's an epidemiologist. So we're offering his evidence. We had to jump through a few hoops, and tomorrow the Crown is going to argue against us relying on his evidence. We think his evidence is very important. It's very compelling. He's extremely well qualified, and his evidence in a nutshell is essentially that Dr. Henry acted in ways which were contrary to the ethical obligations that come with such a powerful position. And there's a number of different areas of his opinion, but that's in a nutshell what he's expected to say.
And it looks like first up of your witnesses, as long as that goes smooth, is former MLA Mike DeJong, as well as the critic for the Attorney General. He wrote a letter early on saying, hey, why is this happening? We have a full interview with him that I will link in the description box below. But what can you tell us right now? The pastors, they weren't in there. I know one of the pastors, Brent Smith, is actually on a mission helping people in Rwanda, you know, those bad law-breaking pastors. But what can you tell us about the clients? What are they thinking about still having to go through this in BC, where we're quite soft on really hard crimes?
Well, I can't speak for them specifically on that point, but you can imagine these folks, I mean, if you had to define law-abiding and respectful people, you couldn't do a better job than looking at these folks.
Public health officer thinks it's safe to worship in a synagogue, but not in a church. You heard that here on Rebel News, where we don't back down from telling you the other side of the story, including matters of persecution against Christians. If you haven't already seen our Tell All documentary that my colleagues put together about just that, you should. You can go to our special website called SaveTheChristians.ca to watch and share it. If it moves you too, you can also put in a few bucks to help cover the many costs involved to bring it to the world.